Welcome to the Qualitalks Podcast, a show about pharma and GMP. The pharmaceutical industry is a fascinating and complex field, and it takes countless people to bring a product to the market. In this podcast, we bring you some of the industry's brightest minds who will share their wisdom with you. And now, please welcome your host, Jan Kugel.
Welcome to our podcast about pharma and GMP. Today, we have Kelly Stanton joining us. Kelly's career has been a fascinating journey from the heart of the pharmaceutical industry as a quality manager to a pivotal role as a quality director at Qualio, an eQMS software company, and then now she's back again to pharma at Corden Pharma. So get ready to dive into her unique experience as we uncover the highs and lows of each role and explore the dynamic challenges faced within the quality systems in the industry. So Kelly, welcome. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks a lot, Jan. It's good to be back working with you again. Thank you.
Yes, so we did quite a lot of virtual events together. You were the speaker of various webinars and events when you were working at Qualio, and it's quite a different experience working for a software provider, right? Than for pharma, right? So how
Yes, it was.
how did you decide to change your position? So you were a quality manager at some point, then you did a complete change to a software provider and quality management system. So can you maybe elaborate about this career path and how it came to be?
Sure. Yeah, it was fun. It was kind of an interesting journey. I was actually working at a medical device company back in like 2014, 2015, and had decided to jump out on my own as a consultant. And through that journey, I had ended up with a couple of different clients. Some of them were device and some of them were pharma, all in the startup space. And it was a lot of fun. You know, none of them were at a point really in their journey where they needed a full-time quality person. And so it's funny now, I see it on LinkedIn a lot. People talk about fractional leadership, right? And this notion of, you know, you don't really need a full-time maybe marketing person or a full-time operations person. And so this idea of having a part-time QA because they're early in their development journey. And through that, I was looking for a software tool that could do my quality system work that was not SharePoint, because I highly do not recommend SharePoint for quality system management. I know lots of people like to use it. It comes free with your Microsoft Office subscription, and lots of startups, you know, figure, oh, we can just do document control in SharePoint. But once you kind of reach that place where you need to really start building up the documentation that you've got to have behind your product as you're starting your journey towards approval, whether that's drug or device, either side. You really need to consider purpose-built software tools. And so I had gotten on Capterra is a website we use here a lot in the States. I don't know if it's a worldwide tool, but it's a great search engine for finding software for different purposes. And Qualio had come up in my search. And I had checked it out, and it seemed like a great option, and had kind of gotten to know, Rob Fenton, the CEO, through that journey. And so had talked with the companies I was working with and convinced them, hey, you guys need to invest in this software. And through that relationship with Rob, kind of that grew into a bit of an advisory role to Qualio, because they were also a startup and also building out their software tool. And, as startups are often want to do, they're kind of funded, and then they're kind of not funded, and then they're kind of funded, and they're kind of not funded. And so in 2019, I had an opportunity to join Qualio full time. They were working on their funding rounds and really looking to accelerate their software growth, and so it was a cool time to join them and really help, kind of build out their software platform from an advisory perspective. Because obviously, I'm not a software engineer. I used to joke I only play one on TV, but really help them understand more in depth. I mean, obviously, Rob has a great background himself, coming from industry as a pharmacist and a pharmaceutical. He spent time in industry too. Um, and kind of help guide through the customer service experience and the engineering experience, et cetera, et cetera. And so became their head of quality for a while there. And that was, I spent nearly 4 years with them. Great organization, great software tool. It's really fun to watch them, and they've continued to grow. I stepped away from there. It was a year ago this month, actually, that I decided to return to industry. Seemed like a good time. And so here I am now at Corden Pharma, doing quality system improvement projects. And it's, a little bit out of the frying pan back into the fire to be back at this pace. But it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
It's
So
interesting.
how is it for a quality person that is used to, putting out fires, suddenly to work in a company that is a software company, but still being in advisor role on quality and so on. So how is the feeling? What is the differences between the opportunities and the positions?
Well, certainly different kinds of fires, obviously. I mean, in a software organization, you've got the customers depending on the tool, right, to do the right thing and, have their documentation be right there, be accessible all the time. I think it was an interesting journey as well. For me, my experiences prior to Qualio with software were not generally cloud-based software tools, right? And as an industry as a whole, I was in industry when Y2K happened, and that was a whole big deal, and everybody was so afraid of it, right? And turned out to be nothing. And now the industry as a whole, right? Everybody's still pretty skeptical of the idea of having all of their stuff in the cloud, right? And so I spent a lot of time helping people become comfortable with this idea of I'm going to put all my stuff in the cloud, and I'm not going to have, full control over every part of my data, right? And how are we working through the regulatory aspects that apply to that and that sort of thing. And so a lot of my fires, if you will, at Qualio involved having those conversations with customers, helping them really understand change management, right? We were changing the software a lot, and how does that work? What does that look like? What's really important from a regulatory perspective? Those were interesting conversations always. Now that I'm here at Corden, this place is amazing. It's fun. We do some incredible products here. We're primarily a peptide manufacturer, one of the largest by volume, doing peptide and some high potence oligonucleotide. I can never say that word. Oligonucleotide products and such things. And really need to bring our technologies forward. And so there's some parallels in that. Also dealing with, a lot of software tools, trying to get those implemented and brought up to speed and really transform our processes. And so some parallel journeys there to the customers I was serving there at Qualio, but, back on this side of the table again now to
Is
do it.
the person who validates the set for the companies, that qualifies the suppliers, right? So
Yep.
what key learnings or insight would you say that you could take from working at Qualio when you came back to pharma? Is it so first you came to Qualio with your insight from pharma. Did you take something back from there which you could say, you know what, this can be implemented in pharma as well? This is such a shame we don't do this or that as well in the pharma
Um,
world.
well, definitely, one of the things I think that pharma could learn from, and I often use this too, is design control in the medical device industry is also very parallel to like the software development lifecycle, right? And that journey of building incrementally and how you document it and test and roll it out in little pieces. And doing things kind of almost snowball-like, right? And in pharma, it's interesting because, we've got to get the molecule to a place where we can, have it complete enough to test in a person, in human, right? And then take those things forward to get all the way to commercialization. Here we're a CDMO, right? A development and manufacture. So a lot of the projects we work on here are early stage clinical, mid stage clinical, all the way through commercialization and fully commercial products that we do out of this site. And so, it was interesting at my time in Qualio to really pull back the curtain, right, in the software development space, understanding how things get built. And yeah, I think some of that learning is interesting here. And sometimes we joke about, okay, so the train has left the station and we're rolling down the tracks, except we're still building the train, right? And here, this site has been here for many, many years. So the train is definitely way the heck down the station. Except it's an old steam engine and now we need to convert it to diesel, right? So yeah, because we've got to scale up. We've got some old infrastructure and some old processes, and we're converting them so that they can scale, and we can support people here to continue to do their jobs and be better and more efficient, and all of those things, and do it well. And so yeah, it's a fun challenge. I like those kinds of challenges. I love looking at a process and figuring out how to do it better and make it better, but also keeping all the regulatory things in mind, right? Of how are we going to defend this when, the regulatory bodies come in and go, okay, so why is this product safe, right? We have to always keep that in mind as we're changing things. And so yeah, it's an interesting challenge.
So why did you decide to come back to pharma? Did you miss the action?
Why did I decide? Oh, geez. Just felt like the right time, I guess. Software's fun, but that's not what I went. My background's in biology and chemistry,
core, right?
and it's not my core. We certainly at Qualio, it was a lot of fun to get to help so many customers bring products to market. But at some point, our ability to do those things is limited to just their quality systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so. So yeah, it's to be back in industry and get to be closer to that process again,
Right.
is really where my heart is.
Right. So how was it for you after how was it for years? How was it to come back into the big shoes that you're wearing right now as a head of quality systems?
Well, little shocking at first. I got here and a month later we had a regulatory inspection. So it's again a little bit like drinking from a fire hose.
Dive directly into the pool, right?
Yeah. I had been talking about what it's like to go through one of those for, 3.5 years and hadn't done one in a while. I mean, we were ISO certified at Qualio. ISO is always a different pace than an actual regulator. So yeah, that was definitely very different. But yeah, it's been fun.
So do you feel that things changed during your time away from the industry, or does pharma move so slowly that it's very difficult, to miss this train, right? So we know that the digitalization is still like in I don't know, probably in the second shift only, right? That's how it feels. Or do you feel it a bit differently?
Pharma moves very slowly. Pharma's, I think device moves a lot faster. Device is a little more open to change, open to risk taking, right? Pharma moves very slow. Pharma is very risk adverse. And that starts all the way up at the regulatory authorities, right? They just, you don't see the same, I used to joke, like with medical device regulations, it's the same set of regulations that applies from Band-Aids to pacemakers and everything in between, right? And so you have to have a different sort of mindset in the ability to take the regulations and interpret and apply. On the pharma side, it's chemistry, right? And it's always there's very much a sort of the chemistry is what it is, and it either works or it doesn't. And you still see it's interesting. One of the things you wanted to talk about is challenges, right? And so one of the big challenges I see happening right now, for example, is around supplier quality, right? So in device, we've had this notion that we have to qualify our suppliers, we have to understand their quality systems, we have to have quality agreements in place. That's been in place for years. That's been an ISO requirement for years and years and years. On the pharma side, the FDA just came out with that guidance in 2017, which is not that long ago. And so we're still seeing challenges where vendors are like, you want to do what? You want us to have we don't need a quality agreement. We have our terms of service. That's good enough. And we're like, oh, no. And then they're like, okay, well, you can come audit, but, sure, have half a day and you can come walk through. And SOPs, you want us to have SOPs? Like we do the things with the stuff. You don't need, we've got a couple SOPs, sure. But like in this mindset of, our suppliers are supposed to have quality systems and they're supposed to have procedures, and this negotiation around the quality agreement because we're purchasing a product and we have to understand how they're managing, like what happens if you change something in the product that we buy from you. Like we need to understand that change, and because then we have to determine, does that have an impact on how we make a product? And if that has an impact on how we make a product, we have to notify our downstream customers, right? And there's this whole domino effect. And we're still, how many years later? 2017, right? So let's do that math. It's 8 years later. And these vendors are like, it's taking months to get quality agreements negotiated and put into place, right? And right, like that shouldn't be a challenge all these years later, right? It's a huge challenge.
And even huge companies that are used to it. So I remember doing vendor qualification myself and working even with a established company like Fisher Scientific, which is their their products that are natural sciences and pharma, and still even with them it took like I don't know more than a year just to close this agreements, because all the red tapes and everybody needs to take a look at this and those lawyers and those lawyers and so that's crazy how long it takes, even for established companies, that there are not enough standardized. There are the templates, right? But still, there is no industry standards what should be there. So each person or each quality manager just inputs there what he thinks to be the right, because I think it's more best practices, right?
It is.
And each person brings their own ideas there, right?
They do, and that is a big struggle. And then somebody like a Fisher Scientific, which is really just a distributor, right? And so if you're buying any like starting materials, now it isn't just Fisher. I need to know who you actually bought that. Like, who did you buy that from?
Yeah, that's crazy.
Right? I have to go
Especially if
upstream.
it's with China, and then
Yeah,
you need the manufacturing certificates,
I
and
need the manufacturing
but they don't
site.
want to give it, and
Mhm.
then when there are different companies, like in China, for example, they have their own uh, you know tax optimizations options where they have different companies, shell companies, and there you need to find the right manufacturer, because they give you something from a different address, and you need to understand how their systems are working. So it can be so complex.
It is, and it's a huge challenge for sure. So that's I'll be interested to see too. I haven't been keeping up a whole lot with that legislation going on in our Congress as well on the Biosecurity Act, but that's going to be an interesting one. And
Yeah,
see how that affects the whole supply chain and everything as well, right? Like that
right.
again, in this process of I don't know where people think their raw materials are going to come from, but that's always an interesting one. We don't
Right.
want we want cheap, we want fast,
And high
We don't
quality,
want
right? Everything at once.
environmental, nobody
Mm.
wants environmental problems with manufacturing. Oh, but don't buy it from China. Like,
Yeah.
okay, okay, well then where do you think it's going to come from?
Yeah, yeah,
So, yeah,
100%, right? So
that's going to be an interesting one for sure.
yeah, yeah, and this is, but I think companies do try right now to have secondary and free even suppliers for the same materials when they can,
Yep,
to keep the supply chain running. But it's also a bit difficult because probably if you have a main supplier, because they're cheaper, they're in China, then you have one in Europe, which is more expensive, but you don't buy from them, so they don't want to commit, right, to the
right.
quantities, right? So this is
Yeah.
like why should we be the secondary? Where are we the number two player here, right? So how do you work around this? What's your opinion here?
Yeah. I think, well, I mean, obviously you've got to work with your customers, because there's regulatory impacts to them too, right? They have to, in the end, they have to manage their filings with the regulatory, authorities and wherever they're distributing the products. It's a very complicated sort of process on their side. And figuring out how to manage that as far as, okay, if we're going here, we're going here, we're going here, we've got to balance all of that from a cost, from a material planning perspective. And yeah, all of those things have to figure into how are you planning, how are you pricing. Yeah, it's a complicated thing, and I'm glad I don't work in purchasing.
That's right. And so, working in Qualio, you worked with many clients in pharma, medical devices, people who sit or sit in in the shoes where you're at right now, right? And
Mhm.
you were able to work in both sides of the mattress. And after working with so many clients and helping with all their challenges, like each company has their own challenge. Now you need to establish new eQMS. Each company has a different uh, way of doing things, and now they have their own challenges. So what did you learn through this process, where you can say, you know what, I learned through this process, I have a toolkit which I can share, and something that I learned that I can do now in your role when you're qualifying a service provider or trying to establish new services, which you say, you know what, now that I did it for so many clients, I have this framework. Is do you have something like this?
Um, yeah, and I think, again, I think one of the biggest things that I emphasized over and over when I was at Qualio was always just keep it simple, right? What is really required versus what's nice to have, versus what's somebody's opinion and what they're used to seeing. I find even here myself very often, right? Like a lot of the systems here have sort of grown out of, lots of time and lots of, again, being a contract manufacturer, constantly having customers come in and tell us different things, right? We have a whole lot of various opinions, right? That have been like, oh, you need to do this and you need to do it this way. Okay, cool. And so there's a lot of layers over the years of things, and so what you end up with in a lot of years like that, and this is true anywhere, right, is a whole lot of, is this really required? Is this really what's needed? And so to get back to like, okay, here's the regulations, here's some guidance documents, right? Obviously, we've got to stay current, and have a good view of the various markets that you're dealing with, and then stripping things away. And as you start to strip them away, what other systems are you impacting when you do that? That can be a challenge. Things tend to get very interwoven and muddy over time. And so I think it was interesting in my time at Qualio to get to see so many different systems, right? And have that perspective of, just the sheer volume. I mean, we were over 600 customers when I left, and I've been gone a year, so I'm sure they've continued to just progress on that number. But to get to see lots of different ideas on how things can be done is always it's good to have that perspective, because when you then come into a new organization, especially one that's been around for a long time, you have that perspective of, here's ways I've seen things work, here's some that work well, here's some that maybe work less well, and just to bring all of that to the table. And as you're sitting in a room with the stakeholders and trying to figure out, as you've got the giant process map out there on the board, like, okay, what about this piece and what about this piece, and being able to pull those from your experience and from the things that you've seen other places or other customers that have helped in the past, right? There were so many systems that we set up there at Qualio, and that was just such a huge benefit to be able to bring all of that perspective into now an improvements role, which is pretty unique. You don't see systems improvement roles very often in organizations. People tend to try to split, process improvements or project improvements and put that into existing roles, right? Like, oh, here's the quality systems manager, and they can do these improvement projects also. The problem with that, and this is one of the things I talk about a lot when I try to explain to people what I do, is that those folks are also so busy in the day-to-day, right? They've still got to keep the lights on, and they've got to keep the products moving out the door. They don't have time to focus on the system improvement stuff. And so it's very hard to actually get anything done in that role, because you're always firefighting and you're always trying to get the product out the door. And so the last thing you're going to focus on is process improvement. And if you don't have that perspective, right, which again comes from seeing lots of other systems, and you aren't given the permission to just focus on the process improvements, right, you can't bring all of that to the table and then make good improvements.
Right.
And
So
yeah.
that's the benefit of working in a big company that can afford having many QA people, right? So if you're talking about mid-sized companies or even API manufacturers, they can have sometimes, for the whole plant, 5 QA people, right? Which do everything from deviations to change control and so on to but in bigger companies, you have for each, you have a team for each part of the quality system, right? So I think this is one of the benefits of the bigger companies who can afford having specialists doing such special projects, right? Like the improvement. So you mentioned that sometimes you need to explain people what you do. So I wanted to ask, so what do you improve? What is part of your your job description? So do you look through your current systems? Did you come and learn how the processes work, and then your job is to identify what can be improved, or somebody tells you, okay, we want to your target is to improve this part of the quality system, or so on? So how does it work?
Some of it is, identified through CAPA and corrective action, right? And so a lot of times, I think, sometimes as things fall down and we generate CAPAs, right? That's an area where, we don't always build in to capacity within, the 5 people at the API plant, right? How much of their job is dedicated to correction? I don't know that we build that in, right? And so part of my role, so I'm focused on systems improvements, right? And so there's another counterpart that I have here who's head of quality operations improvements projects, and he does a lot more of the things related to stuff on the floor. I'm doing things related to sort of infrastructure behind it to support it. So one of the first projects I worked on was training, because we all love the day we started a new job and then we sign into our electronic document control system and we get 400 training emails, because you've got all these SOPs to read, right? And so what tends to happen over time, again, is we write new SOPs and we look at it and go, yep, everybody should train on this. And we
Yeah,
assign it to
that's
everybody,
the pain. Yeah, so this was
right?
as well for me. You come, you get, uh, as you said, if you're lucky, you get it. In computers, or otherwise somebody just kills several trees and
Yeah,
have
yeah. Here's your
yes,
binder,
here's your
right?
binder, and
Plop
that's,
it
and then
down
you're
and
like, what's going on here? As if somebody can remember what you read there within a day or 2 or 3, how much you're sitting there and just checking boxes, right?
yes, exactly, right. So that was one of my first projects was
So
looking
how
at
did you
our
correct it?
um well, I think too, again, as we grew, we were still sort of bucketing, like we just had one title for all QA, for example, and so all of quality was training to everything. But the reality is we have operations quality, we have quality systems, we have development quality, and then we have analytical QA, who is in charge of releasing all the the QC, the data the QC unit generates, and then we have the QC unit. And so everything was getting dumped into just the QA bucket, right? And then we had like everything getting dumped into the operations bucket. But really, what really should be happening, right, is the quality systems folks, we have some oversight of the operations stuff, but I don't need to know how to run a tank. I don't run tanks, right? So
Exactly.
so one of the first, yeah, so right off the bat, right? Operators, same thing, right? We have levels of operators and there's a whole training progression that they go through. We do have a training department here. And so in conjunction with our training manager, we went through all of the procedures and striated out further, right? Nobody had the time or taken the time to sit down and really assess who actually needs to train on all of this stuff. And we took our all employee bucket down from like, I think 160 procedures down to about 50.
That's great.
Right. Because again, it's like, and it's one of those things too. Anytime you write an SOP, and if you say all employees are responsible, what's the
Yeah.
expectation?
Nobody's
Right.
responsible.
Well, and nobody's responsible and everybody has to train.
Right.
Right.
And
The
so
expectation
much
is,
time at the end, so much time wasted at the end.
yeah.
And
And then is that a process, right? So the reality is though, is right, deviation. There's a perfect example. Is everybody really entering a deviation in the system? Or is everybody need to be aware that if they deviate from a process, they need to escalate? And then some people are responsible
right,
for
right,
creating the deviations and entering those in the system and writing
right.
them up properly,
And
right?
this is a great point. So I conducted audits. I think last year I was on an audit, and there was a situation like you described. The SOP says everybody who encounters the deviation must write it down, but when you speak with the operators, they say no, we don't do it. We don't know how to do it, and
No.
then you are in a direct you're in a direct deviation from your own procedures, which is
Mhm.
you know a, it's a direct finding because you are not following your own procedures, right? And if it's okay, GMP audit, it's not that crazy, it doesn't impact maybe the lives, but if you're doing an ISO audit, this is critical as an ISO
Yeah.
organization, and different levels. And I see that this issue quite a lot, that the responsibility is spread. You just said, everybody's responsible for different things, but the people on the ground, it's not the reality for them. And then it's not followed because they just follow the best practices then, right? So this is an issue.
Yeah, definitely. And it's funny because that's also one of those places where the conservative thinking will bite you too, right? So there's this expectation that, like, okay, well, if everybody's responsible for deviation, right? Everybody then has to have trained to the full SOP, even though the reality is that all the operator is doing is raising their issue and saying, "Hey, supervisor, I have this problem." Right? And then the supervisor, because what's happening in reality is the supervisor intervenes, right? They figure out what's going on. The supervisor then notifies quality, right, who gets involved. The two of them get together, figure it out, and then they go off and raise the deviation. And from there, that operator, they'll get interviewed later, but they're never going to see it again. They don't work in the system. So also, they don't need that very expensive software license, right?
Makes
Because the
sense.
reality is that the operator is reading and understanding SOPs in our software system, and that's it, right? They don't need a full license to go,
Right.
edit and create deviation records, right? So there's so many pieces to that. So then what you should really be doing, right? And this comes back to, this was a training issue, right? Everybody was training on the deviation SOP. The deviation SOP is really, really long and really, really complicated. And the operators are like, why am I doing this? Right? Like,
Yeah.
it's not relevant to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So either they read
yeah.
it and they don't understand it, but they just sign as if they read it and
Oh,
understood
yeah.
it, or they spend so much time reading and understanding something they don't really need to understand, instead of concentrating their efforts on the less but more important for them. So it's better for them to read and really understand the 30 SOPs that are
Yes.
important for them than 150 SOPs that 70% have nothing to do with them, which is time wasted, energy wasted, motivation
Yes.
goes down, and your attention is spread across things you don't really need, right?
Yeah. No, and that's where, so in conjunction with that training group, right? We have our monthly operator focus trainings, and we do absolutely emphasize things like GMP training, GMP thinking, including, like, okay, you follow your batch record. If something goes wrong, what do? Right? You raise the issue, you grab a supervisor, you guys determine, is this a deviation? And then what happens from there? But that doesn't mean that everyone trains on the deviation SOP. So we've removed that from their curriculum, right? So that's one less thing they have to go read and understand every time it updates. And then you can really focus their training in on more interactive, more interesting, more relevant to their role. And that allows you also to, um, a lot of times the education level of the operators that we're hiring, right? Those guys they're not required to have college degrees. They're not required to read and understand 30-page documents, right? Like, and so you can really make that training powerful and relevant to them. It's not SOP based. Everybody's understanding goes up. Everybody's time is better spent, right? All of those things contribute to training improvement, GMP compliance, quality culture being better, right? All of that ties together, and that all works really well.
Right, right. And I think it also, uh, if you really specify who is responsible for things, it also reduces conflict that you shouldn't have. Like if somebody who is
Yeah.
not responsible in the logistics to write a deviation, and usually the QA says, "Okay, we'll do it for you," but at some point they might be busy and say, "You know what? It says in the SOP you should do it," and then there are conflicts. I've seen those conflicts that. They're the best practices, but sometimes somebody says, okay, you know what, it's in the SOP. If somebody stepped on
Mhm.
the wrong toe, then suddenly, okay, you need to follow it, and then everything crashes down, right? So
Yep.
and so did you finish this process already with really thinning down the SOPs that people need to learn, so it's finished, right?
We did, yeah. So the procedural side of things is handled and done, and then the rest of the improvements around the on the job and that sort of stuff is
Mm.
ongoing and back within the training department. And then I just continue to participate as a bit of an advisor and sort of their QA brain they can bounce ideas off of when they need help. And certainly, any of the I review a lot of the stuff that they build, and help with infusing, again, sort of quality culture, GMP speak, if you will. But but always with that mindset of, how do we drive that ownership in into the operations, into that organization, and having it come, again, very much from them, so that it's not just something coming from QA. Which, if you're pushing out too many SOPs to read, that's what it feels like. Right? Is like, God, what does quality want us to read now? Right? This doesn't matter. And so they are literally just like, click, sign it off. Click, sign it
it
off.
does make sense, right? Because then they will do it also for things that they actually need to read, right? So this is the precedent that
because
you
none
don't
of
want
it's
to read.
relevant at that point, right?
Right. So they need to feel, that it really means something to read the SOP because they actually do it. And
Yes.
and do you see already the results of this change? Do you see the impact on the people's time and the job satisfaction? Even is it measurable for you?
Well, certainly we see in the training metrics, we see the improvement as far as the compliant. Obviously we're KPIs, right? Everybody wants their KPIs from the various areas, and so we've been measuring the compliance to training completeness on the read and understand side of things, right? Because obviously it's done in a database, and so we can get at those numbers, and so definitely seeing that improvement for sure. As far as, I think, the the word of mouth is that it's better. Certainly people who've been here longer have noticed, right, that they're getting less and less of things that, they're spending less time, or they're getting less, because the system we use here, and I'll just stay agnostic as to which systems they are, but they you get lots of emails from the system, and then if you're late, your boss gets emails, and so it's nice to see less of those kinds of emails about, oh, you're overdue training, so it's nice to see less of those, and we do get feedback that that's better, so that's good.
Right. So you mentioned that there is also this responsibility of quality that you want to spread across the organization, so they understand. So from one side, they don't need to read any SOP because that doesn't make sense, but they still need to understand the total quality. They need to understand why what they're doing, it's so important on a higher level, right? So how do you shape it?
Well, again, so I think I mentioned that we do, there's a lot of that monthly operator training that goes on here, and so that's always the direction we're coming at it from. Like all good pharma organizations, we're doing our annual GMP training, and that gives us the opportunity as well to talk about the why. Why are we doing these things? Why is this important? And trying to level that up really and get beyond. I think. Certainly I wasn't here in the past to know what that was like, but other places I've been where, you get your hour or two of somebody droning on to the PowerPoint slides of here's, 21 CFR part 211, and here's this regulation, and here's this regulation. And, everybody kind of glazes over, and then we all, click the button that we saw it at the end. And so, we're really moving more in a direction of, pulling in a lot more, here's a real life example of from the news. Here's a problem with GMP, and here's illustrative examples of why those things are important. Another training that the organization put on last year was 4 hours around data integrity. And those things were customized to the different areas of the organization. So the operators got an operations focused one, the QA unit got a quality focused one, right? And by focus, I mean the examples and the interaction and the exercises that we had to do, right? And so those were put together by some other folks in the training unit, and another operations person who was involved, and then I helped again with that from a quality perspective on, here's some great content. Here's some examples I know of where, data integrity is absolutely the reason for these failures in, one of them was a supply chain problem where, folks in the supply chain were falsifying certificates of analysis, right? That ultimately resulted in bad raw materials ending up in a product that then caused patient harm, right? And so bringing those things into the trainings and illustrating, like, so as you're filling out your batch record, and if you falsify this, right, like these are the kinds of things that matter,
Yeah.
and here's why those things matter. And
Right.
and when you really bring it all home, we're bringing that kind of stuff into our training programs here, and really trying to level up everybody's understanding and understand the why, and make it real
Yeah.
and bring it home.
So learning from real world examples, I think that's very important. And, even by looking at the warning letters, you can learn so much from there and understand what shouldn't be done, right? And
Yeah.
so, what are your next improvement projects? What do you think is there else to improve? Can you share it?
Uh, Goodness. Well, so, I think next steps working on, I think, so this was one I think that was near and dear to my heart at Qualio too, right? Is implementing document control systems. And when you go off of paper and you implement document control, you don't always, sometimes you're in a hurry and you don't always necessarily think about, like, how could I actually streamline the system and then put it in. Sometimes you just take all your documents, like, I've just got to get it in here and we've just got to get it up and running, right? And once you've been in it for a while and you've used it for a while and everybody kind of starts to understand how to use it, then you go, I wish I'd configured this differently. This would work better if, or, we've got these core documents, but maybe we should split these out and manage these a little bit differently. And so some of the stuff I'm working on now has to do with helping efficiencies within the documents that we control electronically, and then looking for ways to expand our use around that. Electronic batch records is always a hot topic. Everybody wants to do those electronically. Those are a huge lift for any organization. There's so much. Obviously, there's no, SOPs are important, don't get me wrong, but there is no more critical document we do in industry than the document that is how you make your product, right? Would like to get there, but we're not quite there yet. Move in that direction. So,
Right.
yeah,
So for
improvements around that.
companies that haven't started, maybe they don't have a head of quality system improvement, and but they want to try to improve. So how would you rank the most important projects that you would say, you know what, I see it in a lot of companies, and to improve efficiency and quality and the culture? How would you rank the project that you would approach from the most important?
Hmm. Well, I think, like, within document control specifically, or just in general, because I think
Feel free to
document.
talk in general. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so in dot control specifically, I would say, a lot of times what I see people, one of the big mistakes I see people make over and over again, and this was true in my time at Qualio as well, is people keep a lot of processes in place, forms, workflows, steps in workflows that exist because they were doing it on paper. And you don't have to do those things in an electronic system. The electronic system captures those steps for you. And so it is an opportunity to rework your processes if you take it electronic. And so now that's the kinds of efficiencies we're looking for. It really, you don't need a logbook about SOPs, for example, because the system checks the numbers out for you, right? There's a base example. So if you can make how you capture and file your information everywhere in your whole facility simple, that will really improve efficiency for everyone. I think people don't realize how much time they spend writing stuff down. And, we have to document everything, right? Everybody's one of those famous sayings in the industry, right? If you don't write it down, it didn't happen. Everybody loves to say that, right? We always have to produce those records for any inspector or audit that happens. And so wherever you can make those things efficient, and you don't need as many sign-offs and checks as what you had on paper, because the system accomplishes that for you. So wherever you can make those things efficient and leverage the electronic tools that you have, definitely do that. And, certainly there are controls you have to put in place around them, checking your audit logs and some of that kind of stuff all has to happen. But that's a huge one. I think everything you can make electronic, everything you can get off of paper, do it, absolutely do it, because the time and the money you spend dealing with paper around your facility is just such a waste. It is just such a waste.
Right, right. So people who the man hour, the workers' hours that go into documenting and correcting and checking paper, and companies might think, okay, the taking a QMS system will cost us so much money, but probably it can save you the work of several people doing the same thing, or wasting their time on those paper when they can do more important projects like improvement, right?
Yeah,
and, and,
absolutely.
and trying to find other ways to make their processes lean, right?
Yep.
So basically, I think one of the the main takeaways from our talk as well in improvement is try to have your processes as lean as possible, cut everywhere you can, because at the end it saves you the time. If we're talking about the SOPs that you don't need to read or that are not relevant, cut them away, cut out processes that you don't need, right? And use automated tools. I think this is a great summary from the case studies that you brought us today.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, more checklists and more, oh, let's just have them sign off this extra step. You're not really adding any value with that. You really aren't. You're
Right,
just slowing things down.
right. So as long as you have the right checkpoints that are most important, that others don't matter, then you can skip that, right?
Yep.
Indeed. Good, Kelly. So thank you very much for the fascinating conversation. I think it was so enlightening, so interesting to hear about your transitions in your for your career, and all the insights you have on improving processes and how important it is, and how you do the changes and the impact in your organization. So that's just great. So thank you very much for sharing this with us.
Yeah. Well, thanks for inviting me. It's good to work with you again, Jan. And anytime. Happy to jump on again.
Yeah, for me as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Qualitalks podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star review. If you want to learn more about GMP, please visit us at www.qualistery.com. Stay compliant and see you at the next one.